Our little center is geared towards connecting scientists who are studying issues related to national and homeland security with policymakers here in Washington. It is, as you might imagine, a challenging task. To do this, we host a variety of different fora, some on the Hill, some off the Hill. This is an example of one we host off the Hill. I'm delighted to be partnering today with Jeffrey Lewis and the New America Foundation for this discussion on thousands, hundreds, or zero. How many nuclear weapons do we really need? We'll hear from 3 speakers today. I'll introduce them briefly. I'll also introduce our moderator, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. We'll hear first from Arnold Cantor. He is a principal and founding member of the Scowcroft Group and served as Undersecretary of State from 1991 to 1993. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Barry Blackman, who is the co-founder of the Henry L. Stimson Center and the founder and president of DFI International, a research and consulting company in Washington to its sale in 2007. He's now returned to the Stimson Center to do additional research there. Our third speaker will be Dr. Halperin. He is the director of U.S. advocacy for the Open Society Institute and served in a variety of positions in the State Department and elsewhere during the Clinton administration. Our moderator is Dr. Jeffrey Lewis. He is the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Nonproliferation Initiative at the New America Foundation, and as many of you know, is the author of the blog armscontrolwonk.com. Complete biographies are available of all the speakers in the back. With that, I'll turn it over to Jeffrey for a few remarks, and then we will begin today's event. I will please make a request now that when we do get to the Q&A session, that A, you identify yourself, and B, that you ask the question and not make a speech. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be hosting this meeting with Ben and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I just want to say a few words about the Nuclear Strategy and Nonproliferation Initiative at the New America Foundation and the effort that we have underway. Our project started about a year ago, and it's rooted in a sense that there is a bipartisan desire, particularly in the United States Congress, to think again about the principles of U.S. nuclear weapons policy before making a series of decisions that will shape U.S. nuclear forces and U.S. nonproliferation diplomacy for quite some time. And I think we've seen some evidence of that in the reluctance of Congress to fund a variety of initiatives that the Bush administration has proposed. And that reluctance has been genuinely bipartisan, coming in large part during a period of Republican control of the Congress. There are a variety of these programs around town. I guess in addition to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, we have the proliferation of nuclear weapons projects. And I think there are probably a variety of reasons for that. One is these debates in Congress, which we now see reflected in this congressionally empaneled commission on the strategic posture, of which Dr. Halperin is a member. But we also see it in the op-ed that George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry authored, calling for a world free of nuclear weapons. And I think we see it in the political campaigns, particularly the presidential campaign. I'm going to leave the issue of substance to our distinguished panel, but I want to talk a little bit about what it is that we've been trying to do and how we think of our endeavors being different than these other groups. We put together an 11-person bipartisan steering committee co-chaired by Drs. Cantor and Dr. Halperin in order to draft what is essentially illustrative presidential guidance on U.S. nuclear weapons policy as an exercise. And I think our sense was that we could make a contribution if we did two things. If we returned to first principles and re-examined some stale debates in order to try to get at what people have really been arguing about all these years and see if things have changed, and also to focus very heavily on the issue of implementation, which is to say that there are some good policies that cannot be implemented, and therefore maybe they aren't, in fact, good policies. Now, I don't want to leave you thinking that we have a consensus. We don't. I think we've had very good discussions, and I'm an optimist, and I hope that we will get to something like a consensus. But Dr. Cantor is going to open the panel by talking a little bit about our deliberations, the things that he has found interesting, the places he thinks we've made progress, the places where perhaps we have a little bit more distance to go. Following that, Dr. Blackman, who is not a member of our steering committee, but is someone that we all respect and admire, and who we are very excited to have on this panel, is going to talk about I think, a different approach, which is his proposal to draft and sign a treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons. And finally, we're going to close with Dr. Halperin, who's the other co-chair of our steering committee. And I think Dr. Halperin will shed his perspective on some of these debates and also talk about why he thinks elimination is perhaps not the optimal organizing principle for the future of U.S. nuclear weapons policy. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Cantor.
Thank you. I have no idea if it's on, so let me know. As Jeffrey said, our project is intended to devise a nuclear policy that a new president from either party could embrace and make his own. That is our goal. And the process by which we're trying to produce this product is by means of a self-constituted steering committee that intentionally spans a diversity of both policy and political views. And as Jeffrey indicated, we're not doing a traditional study, and we do not intend to produce the usual paper, or given the season of the year, even the usual transition paper. That is not our intention. Rather, we're looking to produce two core products and then some ancillary products. One would be a presidential directive, written as a presidential directive. And the other would be a presidential speech, which would accompany the presidential directive. The directive focused internally to the bureaucracy, the speech obviously addressing external audiences. And the vision is that this directive could be issued and speech could be delivered in the opening days of the new administration, rather than wait the standard 6, 9, or 12 months for all the studies that new administrations always do before taking any initiatives on nuclear policy. And it follows that what we've been emphasizing is the concrete rather than the theoretical, and trying to emphasize things that we believe are achievable rather than ideal. And it follows that our effort is less about developing new ideas than about integrating good ideas, of which there is a multitude out there, into a policy proposal that stands a good chance of being adopted. An important part of our effort is to try to understand and take account of the views and likely responses of key stakeholders, knowing that even if you can persuade a president, first of all, to persuade a president this is a good idea, the president will want to know what do other people, especially people I care about and can cause me trouble, what do they think? And the second is we know that presidents can issue policies, but for them to make a difference, they really have to be implemented, and that cannot be readily done simply by command. So we're going to be trying to assess and engage to get a sense of how the military would view some of our ideas, the national labs, Congress, opinion leaders, key allies, potential adversaries, and key NGO constituencies. It remains to be seen whether we're going to be able to pull this off. As Jeffrey indicated, one of the things that remains to be seen is how much consensus we can forge within our own group. But we've been working at it pretty hard. I think we've made some progress. And the focus of our effort to date has been to work a draft of what we call the presidential directive. And we thought it might be useful to give you a snapshot of some of the issues we've been discussing and indeed struggling with as we've been working drafts of this presidential directive, in hopes of eliciting some feedback from you, which will then be fed back into our process as we go forward. Let me make an important caveat. What I'm about to say is my personal stake on where I think our group stands. And I do not purport to speak for anyone, with the possible exception of myself, and I'm not so sure about that. I think the place to begin is with the areas of agreement, at least what I discern to be the areas of agreement. I think it's fair to say that our group starts from a shared premise, and that shared premise is that the reason the United States needs to retain nuclear weapons is because others have them or seek them. Now that may seem self-evident, but it takes you down a certain path. I think we also agree that our primary objective is to prevent the use of any nuclear weapon anywhere in the world, and to curb the proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons technology. Third, there seems to be agreement among us that in view of the kinds of threats that the United States now faces and is likely to face for the foreseeable future, U.S. nuclear policy, and here when I say nuclear policy, I'm going to mean the policy with respect to employment, force levels, nuclear posture, the whole thing. U.S. nuclear policy can and should be revised rather than merely continued or simply incrementally updated. This is a time for rethinking U.S. nuclear policy. And when you step back and say, okay, how do we link changes in policy to the purposes that we're trying to achieve? I think we've come to the conclusion that the primary reason we should consider changes in U.S. nuclear policy has less to do with any issues or problems related to U.S. nuclear forces and has much more to do with our interest in and our ability to affect the behavior of others. This is important. At the end of the day, the problem is less with our forces than with our ability to get others to behave in ways, including with respect to their nuclear policy and forces, that will help us to achieve our objectives. So we're examining and debating changes in U.S. nuclear policy that would have the effect of enhancing U.S. leadership and creating conditions to induce others, starting with the Russians, to take reciprocal and complementary measures that would reduce the risk of nuclear use and the risk of nuclear proliferation. So that's the causal chain, if you will. And again, that's an important element in understanding what we're trying to achieve and how we're thinking about going about achieving it. Now, having said that, we're also very mindful of the inescapable requirement to preserve the capabilities we need to protect our vital interests and to hedge against the possibility that, notwithstanding our best efforts, others do not respond positively to our initiatives. So that's the other side of it. And I include in this requirement the requirement to continue to be able to meet our security commitments to the security of our allies and partners. We have to be able to continue to do those things, even as we try to do these other things. It includes the need to maintain a nuclear weapons complex that is not only capable of supporting whatever nuclear forces the next president decides are required, but also has the capability to be able to reconstitute a larger force in response to unforeseen and fundamental changes in the international threat environment. You cannot exclude the possibility that despite where we are and where we think the world is headed, that turns out to be wrong in a dangerous way. So what we're looking for in looking at how to revise nuclear policy, we're looking for the sweet spot. It's a sweet spot that would be the intersection of those actions that the United States could take unilaterally that would maximize our chances of eliciting the international responses we see, that's, if you will, one curve, And the other curve is preserving the nuclear capabilities that we're going to need to avoid serious risks to our core security interests. That's the other curve. And we're looking for the sweet spot where those two curves intersect. Finally, I think we have broad agreement on what amounts to a three-part process of how this all would happen, or we hope will happen. The first part begins with a series of unilateral U.S. actions that are intended to encourage, to elicit, the reciprocal and complementary responses that we see. Again, most likely starting with the Russians. The second part is, hopefully, to get the responses, the complementary reciprocal responses that we're hoping for. And then the third part would be to, having achieved these two steps, to work for more far-reaching measures that would be codified in more formal and binding agreements. So the unilateral U.S. initiatives reciprocated, leading to more far-reaching formal agreements. Okay. That in very broad brush, I think, is where we have agreement in our group. Not surprisingly, there's a range of views about how big and bold the initial package of U.S. unilateral action should be. Some members of our group believe that in order for us to have our desired result, the unilateral U.S. steps need to be dramatic rather than incremental. And moreover, these folks believe that the current and foreseeable threat environment, at least the threat environment for which nuclear weapons are relevant, permits such bold unilateral steps rather than have to settle for incremental measures. And an example of such a step would be a unilateral reduction in U.S. nuclear forces down to about 1,000 warheads by the middle of the next decade. Kind of a big idea. Now, there are others in our group who are both more skeptical about the likely effectiveness of U.S. unilateral moves in actually producing the responses we're hoping for. And they're likewise less sanguine about the possible threat environment in the future and our ability to respond to changes in that threat environment if we make these deep unilateral cuts. That make it unwise to take such dramatic steps. And so, for folks who hold this view, rather than go for the bold, a more prudent course of action would be to take unilateral measures, but they'd be more in the style of good faith gestures, pump priming, more modest measures. For example, maybe a U.S. initiative to move early to the lower bound of the Treaty of Moscow limits. So it's unilateral, it would be accelerated, be lower bound, but obviously less dramatic than going down to 1,000 warheads by the middle of the next decade. That's an example of the kind of debate we're having within this framework of agreement. Let me hasten to add, we're not just looking at the question of reductions in force levels. There are similar and in many ways derivative differences among us on issues related to such things as what changes are warranted in the U.S. nuclear force posture, what changes are warranted in operational plans for U.S. nuclear forces, the question of warhead modernization, whether, what, why, how, and nuclear infrastructure, what kind, what should be capable of, and so on. So and the debate tends to coalesce around two broad alternatives: dramatic versus more moderate on each one of these issues. So folks who hold one view on one issue tend to hold predictable positions on the other issues as well. And that is what we're currently debating. And it goes back to judgments about what is required to elicit the responses we want, what is likely to elicit the responses we want, and our risk tolerance given possible developments in the international environment. Judgments about those things lead to judgments about where along the spectrum various members of our group fall out. But let me conclude where I began. And it is to emphasize how struck I have been by a group as, I won't say motley, but as diverse as our group, shares so many premises. The desirability, if not the necessity, of making meaningful changes in U.S. nuclear policy, the reasons for and the objectives of those changes, and the conceptual framework for considering what changes to make. That is what I call the search for the sweet spot. And as I'm doing here now, we're going to be engaging with various publics in an effort to get some sense of where various folks come out, to get a sense of not only the range of views, but also the tolerance for various alternatives. And I hope that in the course of the afternoon, we will start that process. Thank you.
That's great. Dr. Blackman.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here, and I can agree with almost everything Arnie said. However, my reading of the politics of arms negotiations the past 20, 40 years, and reading of the dangers facing us and the rest of the world with regard to nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism have led me to a different conclusion. One that says that the next administration should initiate an effort to persuade all the nuclear weapon states to sit down and negotiate a treaty to eliminate all nuclear weapons by a date certain. Let me back up first on the reasons for this conclusion and then explain how I think such a treaty could work without endangering the security of any nation. I'm a schizophrenic in that I've worked professionally mainly as a technical defense analyst on defense budget issues and force structure things and things like that, but I'm trained as a political scientist, so I've watched arms control and participated in arms control from within the government from both the technical and the political side. And when I look at the politics of arms control, I think the reasons for its very limited success, particularly in recent years, are quite evident, at least in this country. Whatever the president puts on the table, whether it's extension of the START 3 verification provisions or a nuclear disarmament treaty, there will be the same group of opponents. There are the 20 to 25 members of the Senate who impose any infringement on U.S. sovereignty or military flexibility as a matter of ideology. There are technical arguments against any treaty. No treaty is perfect. There are vested interests who will mobilize support because their systems or futures are affected by the treaty. On the positive side, though, there's very little. There's the Arms Control Association and the Small Arms Control Constituency, which does its best, but the types of limited measures which are put on the table do not excite a large political constituency. whether we move from 3,000 to 2,200 deployed weapons, or 2,200 to 1,700, or perhaps this new proposal is more exciting. But what mobilizes a constituency is the idea of moving to zero. That's the one objective which has the moral force and the power to mobilize a constituency that can overcome the inevitable opposition to any sort of proposal. So I think that explains why we've now seen two-term administrations accomplish very little, if anything, in negotiated arms control. I mean, the achievement of getting the former states of the Soviet Union to give up their weapons is certainly extremely important, and we did negotiate the CTBT, but it hasn't been ratified, of course. As best I could tell, the Clinton administration was unwilling to put any political capital behind these measures, and certainly this administration hasn't been particularly forthcoming on it. On the other hand, I look at the proliferation situation, and there I see over the next few years grave dangers. Most importantly, I think if the North Korean and Iranian programs are not rolled back, we're likely to see a further wave of proliferation in both East Asia and in the Middle East, with the latter being the most dangerous. There's already been, as you know, I think 6 nations around the Persian Gulf who are expressing new interest, or in North Africa, expressing new interest in civilian nuclear power programs, the first states who are getting these capabilities. Secondly, we have the NPT review conference coming up in 2010, and the repeated promises of the nuclear weapon states, this time we mean it, we're moving toward nuclear disarmament, have less and less credence. And we can see this in the increasingly bitter tone of the prep cons and the inability to reach agreement even on agendas in these meetings. And thirdly, there's the US-India nuclear agreement, not yet dead and perhaps alive, depending on Indian politics, which if passed, I think would gravely undermine the nuclear suppliers group, as the US would have to seek exceptions for India. And if we did that, I see no reason why Russia wouldn't seek exceptions for its customers and China exceptions for its customers and so forth, undermining the very structure of the anti-proliferation. So looking at the difficulty of moving forward with limited measures on the one hand and the risk we face on the other, I've come to the conclusion, as many others have, that there's a need for a radical approach that can mobilize political constituencies, regain the high ground in the proliferation debate and process, and eventually eliminate the threat of nuclear terrorism and nuclear war. And moreover, I think this can be accomplished safely, gradually, over a period of years, without raising risks to the security of any nation. The difference, though, between this approach and the more gradual approaches is that in this approach, the commitment, elimination by a date certain, would be put on the table from the very beginning. This is the heart of the treaty. We, the nuclear weapon states, at least those that sign this treaty initially, commit that given fulfillment of the conditions in this treaty, we will eliminate all nuclear weapons by X. To me, I think this has to be at least a 20-year process. I look at the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Treaty, and let's say 20 years is certainly a minimum. It's probably somewhat longer than that. It's up to the governments to decide how far away that may be. But the important thing is, unlike the open-ended commitment in Article 6, it's a commitment with a definite ending date. What else would be in the treaty? First step, of course, would be that all signatories would have to declare their nuclear weapon stocks, components, materials, and facilities. Holdouts are certainly possible. There's no reason why Israel, for example, would have to join the treaty from the beginning. It's essential that the US, Russia, China, perhaps India join the treaty from the beginning, but certainly there needn't be a complete set of signatories. These declarations would be audited, safeguards would be put on them, and then they would be verified by multinational agency. Perhaps it should be the IAEA. I'm not sure. Perhaps there should be a replacement agency. In either case, it obviously would have to be an agency with many more resources and good relationships with national means of intelligence to make this verification work. Fourth, there would be the phased, verified dismantling over a transitional period with set milestones of these nuclear weapons and the facilities that support them. This could and should begin with the US and Russia, since we have by far the largest inventories. And I certainly wouldn't mind if the process were kick-started with by unilateral reductions on our part and on the Russians' parts by any means. We know how to verify dismantling of
launchers and facilities. We've had practice with South Africa, and in the SALT agreements, START agreements, INF agreements for some aspects of this. There have been experiments concerning how to dismantle warheads without compromising design information and so forth. There's nothing really has to be invented here. It's a question of working out the detailed procedures necessary to do this safely. Fifth, the treaty would have to guarantee, it should guarantee, access to nuclear materials for civilian purposes to all nations. But it should deny to all nations national fuel cycles. Fuel cycles should be placed under multinational controls. Perhaps there should be a consortia of nations. Perhaps there should be several sources to maintain competition and price here. Perhaps there should be private, public consortia. These things have to be worked out. But clearly, if there are national fuel cycles, the risk of rapid breakout from the treaty is too great to make it work. So a key part is multinationalization of fuel cycles. Six, the treaty should include a variety of enforcement mechanisms to deal with the possibility of cheaters and the risk of breakout. We're doing research on what these might look like now, but in principle, they can include automatic sanctions and isolation of any cheater. They could include the pre-authorized use of collective military force with conventional means, such as in the case of the Israeli takeout of the Syrian reactor. It certainly shows how conventional forces could deal with the beginnings of the program, at least. They should include personal responsibility for anyone in the government of a cheating state. They should be held accountable personally for these things. And there are some ideas that there perhaps should be a reserve, disassembled multinational nuclear force that could serve as a deterrent in the event of a breakout. I'm not so sure that that's a good idea myself, but it's something, various designs of which that we're looking at as well. And finally, the treaty needs off-ramps. There needs to be ways for the participants, the signatories, to suspend their participation if the various milestones are not reached. If the US, Russia begin the process and start dismantling, if China joins in, the UK joins in, and France holds out, well, at some point then these other countries will want to suspend their participation. And there have to be ways to do that within the confines of the treaty without breaking the regime altogether. So I think it is possible to design an architecture and to
detail the necessary steps to permit over a protracted period of time this dismantling of nuclear arsenals, and to do it in a way such that each country is protected and assured that its nuclear stocks can continue to serve the one purpose which Arnie's group and most everyone else recognize nuclear weapons serve, which is to prevent their use by anyone else. Now, I just add that I'm not alone in this craziness. There's a growing group of people who are working on this project, which won't be launched officially until the fall. There'll be a rich research analytic agenda. We'll be circulating papers, giving details on how these processes would work, and we're encouraged debate among informed people and more general audiences about it. There'll be a big political public outreach effort to promote this, as well as track 2 diplomacy aimed at sometime bringing this from a private initiative into something that governments might negotiate among themselves. And I just close by saying that taking this approach doesn't rule out either of two things that Arnie mentioned. One is the possibility of unilateral cuts. And as I said, I think that's a good idea, or de-alerting in some cases, as means of encouraging the process. And nor does it rule out the necessity for modernizing, continuing to modernize to the degree necessary, U.S. Forces and the nuclear infrastructure. As I say, this is a process that will last at least 20 years. And there needs to be, and as a form of leverage in the negotiations, other countries need to believe that the U.S. is prepared to maintain its much smaller arsenal in the event that this process should, for some reason, break down. I'll close it down.
Great. Dr. Halperin.
Well, I agree with a significant amount of both what Arnie said and what Barry said. Let me fill in a little bit, at least one part of the debate that Arnie described, and also explain why I think that the effort to try to negotiate a treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons is misplaced and in some ways dangerous and counterproductive. I believe that if the next president of the United States was persuaded to take on this effort, to get a consensus in the United States that we should support a treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons, that the president will not be able to do anything else on the subject of nuclear weapons. That debate, while it will bring out some of the people on the side for elimination, it will also bring out the people on the other side who will argue, I think plausibly and persuasively, and in my view correctly, that elimination of nuclear weapons is not a feasible goal as long as we have nation states with military forces. One cannot uninvent the knowledge to make nuclear weapons, and I think the effort to negotiate these kinds of agreements about sanctions and isolation and automatic sanctions. There's a set of debates we saw when we debated general and complete disarmament in the early 1960s, and I think they are as unrealistic about elimination of nuclear weapons as they are on general and complete disarmament. And I think the United States debate on nuclear weapons will be consumed by that subject, and that it would provide both an excuse and a requirement not to do anything else. And you already see that, I think, in the statements of the candidates. If you look, for example, at Senator Obama's statement about this subject, he says he is for the elimination of nuclear weapons, but of course, until that is possible, we will maintain robust and effective nuclear forces. And I think that has it exactly wrong. I think the debate in the United States needs to be about what kind of nuclear capabilities we need and should have in order to advance the objectives that the other two speakers have provided, in a world in which nobody believes that it is realistic to eliminate nuclear weapons. In the best of all worlds, we would debate what the treaty should look like in the United States through at least the first term of the next president. We would then debate the treaty with other countries for 20 or 30 years, and then perhaps have a 30 or 40-year time frame in which there would be agreement to eliminate nuclear weapons, which offer off-ramps that would end the treaty process 5 or 10 years after it began, even assuming that the Russians would sign the treaty. It is not clear to me, for example, that the Russians think that the only purpose of nuclear weapons is to prevent others from using them or encouraging them not to develop them. Unlike the United States, they are a weak conventional power, and it is not clear to me that if we were assessing Russian security, we would reach the same conclusion as I think we've all reached about American security. That is, spending more money than the rest of the world put together on conventional forces. We do not need nuclear weapons to enhance our security. But it is not clear to me that any of the other nuclear powers agree with that, nor that it would be conceivable that any of them would agree to elimination. And I fear that if we go down that route and use our energy and our intellectual energy to try to design a treaty for the elimination of nuclear weapons, we will fail to take on the hard and, in my view, much more important question of what are the unilateral steps the United States can and should take to reduce the risk that our nuclear weapons are used, but even more important, to enable us to move forward with an effective non-proliferation regime and to persuade the Russians to reduce the size and the alert status of their own nuclear forces. And I believe that there are important things that the United States can do, and that the community of people concerned about nuclear war ought to focus on getting a consensus on those steps and a consensus on a more limited treaty, because I think those two things are feasible and will in fact advance the objective of reducing the risk of nuclear war. Now, the unilateral steps, Arnie has, I think, given the framework for them. Let me just pull in some of the things that I think we ought to do. I think the President should announce that the United States is moving unilaterally and as quickly as possible to a stockpile of less than 1,000 weapons. I think that's the announcement he should make on the first day, and I think he should ask his advisors and the military to say what that number below 1,000 could be. I have no doubt in my own mind that it can be 1,000, less than 1,000. I think it might turn out that it could be substantially less than 1,000. I think the President also ought to announce that we have nuclear weapons only to deter others from using them and to discourage others from getting them, and that means that the United States will not use nuclear weapons first. I think the President should also make it clear that it is the policy of the United States not to use nuclear weapons on warning of an attack or even on receipt of an attack, and that he should instruct the military to design a nuclear posture which permits the United States to survive any conceivable nuclear attack, and then to determine what form its retaliation should take. I think the United States should make it clear that it has no intention ever of testing, that it has no intention of developing any new nuclear weapons, that it is ready to sign a treaty ending the production of fissionable material, that it is removing all its nuclear warheads from any facilities outside the United States, and will commit itself only to store its weapons within the United States. I think that set of unilateral steps will do much more to encourage countries to go forward with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to encourage the Russians to engage in bilateral and ultimately multilateral negotiations, and reduce the risk that nuclear weapons will be used, than my view, futile debate about whether the United States should seek to negotiate a treaty with other countries looking to the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, I do think we should engage the other nuclear powers in an effort to negotiate a treaty, but I think the treaty should not seek this ultimate elimination. but rather should seek a series of steps. And they're actually the steps that Barry outlined as the first 5 steps in his treaty process. I think nuclear states should be asked to commit themselves to announcing the size of their stockpile, to not increasing the size of their stockpile, to not producing any fissional material, to separate the warheads from the missiles and the other delivery systems so that they cannot launch them quickly, to subject that separation to international verification so that they can only move to reunite warheads and delivery systems being visible to international inspectors. They should agree to reduce their stockpiles ultimately to several hundred nuclear weapons. I think that accomplishes almost everything that the elimination process would accomplish, but it avoids all the hard problems of what do you deal with rogue states and sanctions and breakout, and I think is a much more feasible posture. On the other hand, I think it is bold enough and serious enough to engage the rest of the world. Now, I think this debate, the one we're having in the group that Arnie and I are part of, and in the general public, turn on 2 questions that I think remain unresolved among the people who debate this issue, but are actually, I think, impenetrable to the rest of the world. And that is the question of what is the domestic politics of the nuclear weapons issue, and what is the relationship between the American nuclear posture and the likelihood that other states will try to get nuclear weapons. On the first question, you may recall that President Clinton often in his speeches said that the United States no longer targets within Russia. And his political people will tell you that that sentence got more applause than anything else he ever said in any of his speeches. I asked them how much applause they think it would get if we actually did that. And they thought that was an interesting question. They were startled to know that we had not done it. But I think, in fact, the politics of this issue is what it was reflected in that applause. That most Americans would be astonished to know that the United States has hundreds and hundreds of nuclear weapons on alert, that somebody still follows the president around with a football with the notion that he might, in the middle of the night, wake up and authorize the firing of large numbers of nuclear weapons, because presumably Soviet nuclear weapons from the non-existent Soviet Union or from Russia are being fired at the United States. That would astonish, I think, everybody in Washington but the people in this room and maybe 20 or 30 other people. And I think a president who announced what I suggested he announced, most Americans, I think, would react by saying, didn't the first Bush administration do that? And in any case, clearly it is within our interest to do it. The other debate, which continues and continued within the Clinton administration, as well as presumably in the Bush administration, is the question of how other states will react to our nuclear posture. And the 2 views are roughly, as you know, one is that reducing our nuclear arsenal or the readiness of our forces will only serve to encourage more nuclear proliferation. That the Germans and the Japanese will decide they need nuclear weapons, that the Iranians and others will be encouraged to think since we're reducing, they can match us, and therefore they will get nuclear weapons. So that rather than enhancing non-proliferation, it will increase the incentive of states to get nuclear weapons. And we are debating within our group whether the United States can take the remaining nuclear weapons out of Europe. And we're told that this will produce great anxiety in many states in Europe, and probably a decision by 1 or 2 states to begin their own national nuclear weapons program. Now, the problem I find with this argument is that it's been made all along. The United States went from, in 1968, a posture of saying that we will use nuclear weapons as soon as there is any Russian use of military force, to now having 200 or so nuclear weapons in Europe. And at every stage of the change, from 6,000 nuclear weapons ready to be used instantly to 200 weapons totally separated from their delivery systems, we were told that this would be the result. And it has never, of course, been the result. I think the politics of this issue in other states is no different than the politics in the United States, and that the United States, if it consults properly and moves carefully, and in my view avoids the specter of elimination, and rather talks about substantial reductions, that we can do this in a way that in fact advances on non-proliferation in general. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much. We have 2 standing microphones at which people may queue if they would like to ask questions. In doing so, I would like to strongly encourage you to actually ask a question. I don't know if you know the joint New America AAAS staff, but they're quite violent. And they are very likely to inflict physical pain if one goes on for too long. Unfortunately, we will have a model question opening things up with Dr. Zimmerman.
Really? I'm Pete Zimmerman, retired from King's College London. I have to say I agree with Arnie and Mort rather closely, but I'd like to ask you to sketch out a little bit what you think the residual nuclear force might look like, because it's not just the number. 1,000 tactical nuclear weapons is not the same thing as 1,001 megaton nuclear weapons, is not the same thing as the present mix on the SLBMs. So how would you apportion some of these? Because I think the way you apportion them has a great deal to do with the final number you will come out with as to how many we need.
Gentlemen.
Let me respond as follows. First, our group has not discussed that question in any detail.
We can have a personal opinion.
It's not just a sensible question, it's a key question, but we've not discussed it. Moreover, it is our instinct, which I think is informed by just an irresistible urge to kick the can, to say that, in fact, that is properly one of the issues that a president would ask his Secretary of Defense, Chairman of Joint Chiefs, and all the other appropriate officials to come back to him with options, rather than the president on the first day of his administration, ex cathedra, to say, here are the specifications. Having said that, I think that if you're looking at a collection, I use the term collection of steps, looking at a collection of steps that tend to be toward the bold end of the spectrum, which would be deep cuts, transparent efforts to demonstrate no intention to use nuclear weapons first, that we have a policy not to rely on launch on warning, launch on attack, and so forth. Seems to me that inevitably would fall disproportionately on the ICBM force. And so as a result, if not as an intention, a force at the lower levels we've been discussing would be a force that I believe would be what I call SLBM heavy, rather than ICBM heavy, or a balanced triad. With respect to warhead characteristics, given or I think a consensus among our group that the United States should not develop nuclear weapons with new military capabilities. If you accept that, that's the name. If you accept that, then you're essentially working with existing warheads, derivative of existing warhead designs, maybe remanufacture them, but it seems to me there's a strong presumption against design and also an indefinite moratorium on nuclear testing. There's a strong presumption that you are essentially working within the broad bounds of of the existing nuclear warhead inventory. And that's a constraint. If you don't like that constraint, then you get to rely on some of these conditions, but doing so has other consequences. So, I mean, to summarize, we face this. The president's likely to ask his senior advisors rather than dictate. Probably going to end up with a force that has a greater emphasis on SLBMs than today, and probably working at the margins of existing nuclear warhead designs.
Or would you retain any small weapons?
Like tactical nuclear weapons? My own self-made. Assuming Mort is right about the reaction of sort of in NATO of getting rid of them, I would not. My view is that if we didn't have theater nuclear weapons, we would never deploy them and probably would never invent them. And I suspect that our allies, if they didn't have to make a decision about getting rid of them, would just as soon see them gone.
Dr. Halperin, did you want to add something?
I have a sort of radical view of the subject. I believe that the United States has never developed a nuclear device that has any military capability. I believe it is a fundamental misconception to think that we have things called nuclear weapons. Every time we have looked at the question of how to use them in military combat, we have concluded correctly that it was not a good idea, because they can't be used in any way that advances political or military objectives, given their destructive power, and given the overwhelming interest that the United States has in maintaining the moratorium on the use of nuclear weapons, which existed since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So my answer to the question is, it doesn't matter. I would not keep any small weapons. I never would have deployed small weapons. I was against small weapons when the Russians were in Berlin. I think we don't need them. I think what we need is a residual nuclear force that makes it clear to other countries that you can't blackmail anybody by saying we have 2 nuclear weapons and nobody else has any of them. My own view is I would keep the ICBMs. I think it is an enormous waste of money and extremely and more dangerous than it's worth to have nuclear weapons patrolling the seas with nuclear weapons in them and the capacity to fire those nuclear weapons just by a decision of all the people on the ship. That seems to me extraordinarily dangerous and totally unnecessary, because it is based on the assumption that there is some possibility that the Russians, who are the only ones who have this capability, will wake up one morning and decide that it is in their national interest to launch a surprise nuclear attack on the United States, because they could probably destroy most of our delivery capability. I think that is a zero option possibility. And therefore I would keep ICBMs, because I think the only conceivable time we would want to threaten the use of nuclear weapons is if somebody else was threatening to use them, and being able to say to the Iranians or the North Koreans or somebody, you know, we have these ICBMs, we can fire them very quickly, we will destroy your country. Seems to me a useful part of a nuclear arsenal if you're going to keep one. But I think, I agree with Arnie, President should not make this decision on the first day. And I think when he asks the military, we will end up with an SLBM-only force. And I certainly think that's the way to get people to buy into this proposal. It's worth doing.
Let me just interject that silence should not be taken to connote agreement.
Dr. Taney.
The answer to the previous question led me to a series of other questions I would ask, but I think I'll stick with my original thing. As Jeffrey hinted in his opening, there are many organizations in town that are looking at this question of U.S. nuclear weapons policy, and as it happens, AAAS is one of them, jointly with the American Physical Society and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And we're wrestling with the question I'm hoping that you can answer for us, and that's, why do we have nuclear weapons? What purpose do they serve? You seem to hint that the purpose they serve is to prevent the use of weapons by other people. If that's true, how many do we need? And 1,000 seems to be too many. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And secondly, it's been postulated by some that if the U.S. gives up its nuclear weapons entirely, then it is no longer a superpower. And that seems to me to be a rather bold and dramatic statement. So I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
The question of how many weapons do we need is a question with no mathematical answer. Any number we have had, do have, or will have is in an important sense arbitrary. You cannot derive force size from requirements because, as more implied, it's very hard to identify military requirements for nuclear weapons. And if the core requirement for nuclear weapons is essentially deterrence, then no one's yet figured out how to go from numbers to the mind of man and back again. So there's no magic number. The number probably is some function of tolerance in domestic politics sense, which in part is affected by the numbers that other guys got and got. It's not, in my view, it's not very useful to argue about whether you need 1,000 or 1,100 or you need 1,100 or 1,500, because you will not come to a derivable answer. So we're talking about, I believe we're talking about you need 20, 100, 500, 1,000, it's sort of those lumps. And my own view is that for the first step, the U.S. unilateral step, reducing the number of deployed weapons by half, as half below Treaty of Moscow limits, which we're not at, but a further cut by half, it's not chopped liver. There are others who would reduce that number much more. And just so remind everyone what you all know, there are at least two components to this. One is what's the number, and the other is to what does the number refer? Deployed weapons, weapons in the overall stockpile, and the number has no meaning without knowing what it refers to. So you can get, you can say 1,000 weapons and end up with a huge variation in the number of weapons in the stockpile. So to be clear about that. But there's I think inevitably, since political debates tend to be pretty simplistic, at the end of the day, the political debate will center, rightly or wrongly, on how many weapons. And all this other stuff will be about policy, but the politics will be about, of course, the number. And part of the art of politics is the art of the possible. My hunch is that a lot of the give and take around the number will be buried into what the number refers. Deploy, stockpile.
Please.
There may be very few, or there may be difficult to imagine military uses of nuclear weapons, but there are tried and true practices that various parts of the defense bureaucracy will use to calculate for you the number of weapons on target you need to achieve various policy goals. And so if you go to the military and say, we're going down to 1,000 weapons, what should they be? The first thing you will get is a whole bunch of pushback, because 1,000 weapon stockpile means, by the way they calculate things, a very small number of deployed weapons, and they'll say, we therefore can't take care of contingencies A through K that we've been planning on, and particularly contingencies involving a newly antagonistic Russia, which we have to keep allegedly some reserve against. So, there are, whether you believe them or not, there are these processes by which number of weapon requirements are calculated, and the new administration is going to have to deal with that and provide the policy guidance which justifies going down to such a small number of deployed weapons.
Yeah, I agree with that. I actually think that's the critical interaction between the president and the military. The president has got to be willing to say to the military, I understand that you can't do that, but nobody thinks, and I don't think it's necessary to do that to advance the security interests of the United States. I think we need to begin that discussion by remembering that the assured destruction numbers came backwards. That is, we had a force, and there was efforts to get a much larger force, and that therefore McNamara came up with this number saying, let's invent the highest possible requirement for nuclear weapons. Now I can show you we have more than we need for that purpose, therefore we can't need any more. Nobody really believed that you needed to be able to assure with high confidence the destruction of 25% of Soviet industry in order to deter the Soviet attack. It was an argument, an a fortiori argument, not a minimum requirement argument. And I think, over time, this has continued again in a way that I think would astonish. I mean, what Barry just said would astonish almost any American who's not a part of this debate. That the Pentagon still believes that some quantity of destruction of Soviet industry, which, by the way, every lawyer in the Pentagon will tell them now is illegal, is a necessary requirement for deterrence. I think that nobody not steeped in that believes it, but the president, I think, is going to have to bite that bullet and say to the military, the requirement I have for you is a force that will survive any conceivable attack and give me the option to deploy a very small number of nuclear weapons against targets that I will identify after the attack. And I think it's not right when Arnie said that the politics of this issue is only about the number. I think actually that statement by the president to the military will produce a political firestorm. I think it's one the president will win, but I think it will produce a political
firestorm. All of our speculations about reactions to this or that have yet to be tested, first point. Second point, nuclear weapons are not the career-enhancing path for the military that they once were. And so I think it's probably a mistake to assume that, quote unquote, the military is so wedded, for whatever reason, to large nuclear forces that they will be an important source of opposition. In fact, there is, in some respects, a contrary problem. If you believe that the number of nuclear weapons the United States will need is some number greater than 0, and if you believe that these weapons ought to be safe and secure, the deployed weapons, the deployed weapons need to be safe and secure, the question is, how do you motivate military personnel to be conscientious, to be serious about maintaining safe, reliable, and yes, alert nuclear weapons? It's one thing during the Cold War we actually thought something might happen that motivated 18 and 19-year-olds to drive out through the snows of North Dakota to go crawl down the damp holes to see if the missile was still cooking. That's getting harder and harder. Persuading submarine crews, naval personnel, to go out on boomers and submerge for 90 days at a time is getting harder and harder. So, in my view, at least as great a concern is as how to overcome military resistance to reducing the size of the nuclear force is how do we maintain a secure, reliable whatever nuclear force we maintain in a secure and reliable manner.
We've got a queue of questions. Since Stephen was up first, I'm going to start there, and then we're going to go back and forth. So Stephen Young and then Ethan.
Stephen Young, the University of Scientists. On the point you just made, Dr. Cantor, the key question, one of the questions right now is the question of the responsive infrastructure. Does the U.S. need the ability to make new warheads in order to make the country talking about? The position said yes, we need to be able to make new warheads in order to make more reductions beyond what's already declared. But in fact, as you look to 80% in 2007, we didn't make any warheads at all. Modify some, reverse some, we didn't make any at all, didn't have a problem having that situation. Does the U.S. need to be able to make new weapons to be able to make these changes in weapons policy, or is really making what we have now a good option?
Well, I mean, I think, again, the question, in my view, turns on a misconception. That is to say that the quality of the warheads and their ability to do very precise things is important because they're weapons. And I just don't believe that that's true. I believe that the only function they serve is to deter others from using them. I also believe that if anybody actually used one, we would respond with a conventional attack and not a nuclear attack to that use, and that would be the sensible thing to do in that situation. So I don't know how to answer that question. I think as a political matter, I would trade support of the weapons community for a production cutoff, a test ban, no new designs of weapons, to a commitment to them that they can maintain a robust capability to, quote, modernize the existing weapons as necessary to keep them active and alert, because I don't think that fight worth having, and I think we need the support of that set of people if we're going to have the production cut off, the fission material treaty, and the test ban ultimately ratified.
I have a slightly different view. It seems to me that it is possible to maintain the following two positions simultaneously. One is that there is no military requirement in the weapons effects sense, or no sufficient military requirement in the weapons effects sense for nuclear weapons. So I agree with more of that point. But depending upon what you think it takes for a nuclear deterrent to be credible, you need to begin to ask yourself whether it actually matters, whether other people believe that you have weapons that will work, that if you push a button, something happens, that they'll sort of land on target, that they will produce the weapons effects somewhere in the neighborhood of what you had intended. You may conclude that actually none of the things really matter, and therefore you don't have to worry about that stuff. But insofar as you think that the effectiveness of the deterrent is a function in part of its credibility, and its credibility in part depends upon a plausible unfoldment if a decision is made to use them, then it actually does matter what kind of weapons you have and how they're going to work and so forth. And that has implications for the nuclear infrastructure. Two, you do have an analogous problem with respect to, if you think you need the nuclear infrastructure for other reasons in addition to the political considerations more articulated, if you think sort of, well, on the merits, you need a nuclear infrastructure for other reasons, then you have to ask yourself, well, how do you keep folks motivated to kind of work in that infrastructure? You have to invent stuff for them to do that doesn't motivate them. And you can argue that we shouldn't be making that kind of work for them. But if you're going to have an infrastructure, you have to ask the question, how do you populate it? Third, it seems to me that you can both believe that any unforeseen developments in the international environment would take years to develop. Take a long time rather than a short time to develop. And to believe that notwithstanding that, you need the ability to be able to respond to those developments should they occur. So that argues that if you think you need to have nuclear weapons, and they need to have some modicum of credibility, and you believe that there could be change in the international environment, which would lead you to increase rather than further decrease the nuclear weapons force, then you need an infrastructure that has that capability, not the automaticity, but the capability to be able to meet those conditions should they arise.
Hi, I'm Dee Chode from the Nonproliferation program at Carnegie Endowment. I'm wondering to what extent your projects have taken into account the opinions, policies, positions of key non-nuclear weapon states. And I ask this because I think on the Nuclear Posture Review project, you'd find that the reality of that landscape is one that might weigh heavily on your internal debate about dramatic versus incremental steps. And then on the treaty project, I think you might find that some of the ideas you've proposed are non-starters, particularly around anything that's seen as an infringement on Article 4 and particularly around foregoing indigenous fuel cycles. And the reason I raise this is my concern from having talked to a bunch of these states is there's a perception of U.S. insensitivity to those dynamics and also a tone deafness on our part. And I think that that can actually trip up the implementation of many of the things that you propose.
I certainly agree with the tone deafness, and I've seen the complaints that have been taken. However, I think that they stem basically from the disbelief of the non-nuclear weapon states in the nuclear weapon states' commitment to denuclearize. And I think that if there were this commitment to negotiate the treaty, it changes the entire dynamic, both within the CDNPT process and the political dynamic among the nuclear weapon states themselves, and makes what seems infeasible today feasible. The treaty, as I said, would guarantee access to civilian nuclear materials. It's just a question of putting the fuel cycles under multinational controls, and those multinational organizations would obviously have to include states like Brazil, South Africa, and so forth, who otherwise would certainly object to it. But if the nuclear weapon states themselves are giving up national fuel cycles, then I think it changes the whole dynamic of that interaction. And the other thing I'd add is I've come to this conclusion because of the concerns about proliferation and the proliferation regime. I've watched the Bush administration have the nuclear stockpile, or announce its intention to do that, with no effect on that process. And I think even as dramatic a reduction as Arnie and Mort's group is advocating would have the same non-effect. What's needed is the commitment to elimination with a date certain on the table to change the dynamic in the NPT process.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I want to say, so that Arnie doesn't have to, there is no agreement within our group. But it is a view that some of us have. The view, I would guess, of this administration is the same as the Clinton administration, namely that this alleged view of the non-nuclear states active in the NPT process is actually the view of a small number of professional ambassadors who hang out in Geneva and hold this view, and that when you really go to senior levels of the government and make clear U.S. real security concerns, all of this fades away. Now, I think that has some element of truth to it, and that the other side of it is true as well. That is to say, there are countries which would be nervous if we did the things that these ambassadors want us to do, including some of the countries where these ambassadors are from, because they fear, they do rely on the U.S. nuclear arsenal. So I think figuring out where these states really are is not simple. I do not agree with Barry that the only way to engage them, or even a real way to engage them, is by coming out for the elimination, because I think while some of the people in these negotiations will believe it, I think the rest of the governments will not, and that the militaries will not, and they will say this is an excuse to engage in 40 years of negotiation. I think the kinds of steps we agreed to when we got the permanent extension of the NPT are the steps that people really care about, and that's the kinds of steps that I'm talking about. Things that actually reduce the degree to which the United States and other nuclear weapon states rely on nuclear weapons is what I think at the end of the day these countries really care about, and I think a dramatic statement by the President, in effect recommitting ourselves to an updated version of that list, is the way to effectively engage these countries.
Our speakers are coming to the end of the panel where we have folks with other commitments, but in a rare moment of empathy for other people, particularly those standing. I think we'll take a round of 4 questions if you could keep them pithy, and we'll start with
And I'm Diane Perlman, psychologist for social responsibility and also Abolition 2000 Global Council. Anyway, speaking of, you said that we have nuclear weapons because other countries have them, but also it seems that a lot of, did you say that we have them because others
have or seek.
Have or seek. Well, also that they have them because we have them. So my question is about if there are parallel processes, say political and also psychological, of tension reduction, security assurances, and nonviolent conflict transformation to reduce the felt need for nuclear weapons, say rather than being provocative, threatening, which would increase the desire for nuclear weapons. So is there something in the plan? Like, for example, if we would have accepted Iran in 2003, we wouldn't be dealing with this now. So there are other ways of reducing the cycle and having the other
Perfect.
Tension reduction working.
Yes. And then Eric?
From the Center for Defense Information. In the context of the Treaty for Elimination, it seems pretty clear to me, as Barry mentioned, that we need some sort of internationalization of the fuel cycle, or we need to deal with the energy and fuel cycle issues somehow. I was curious where you guys think that those steps, where the fuel cycle fits into the more sort of immediately achievable steps that we're talking about. I didn't hear much about that.
I'm Walt Slocum. I'm in the Defense Department for half the I have 2 questions. One, I think Barry is entitled to a question actually about his proposal as opposed to the mechanics. The premise is that if the United States and the other nuclear powers give up nuclear weapons, countries like Iran or North Korea would be more likely rather than less likely to give them up. What is your answer to the argument that in fact it would be more attractive for countries, for, if you will, rogue states, if they knew that instead of having a tiny nuclear arsenal compared to very large ones of other states, they have the only nuclear weapons in the world? And the second is to Mort. You said that we should have a posture which is highly survivable. How is that consistent with the idea that in order to have a credible deterrent, you would have to move, and presumably move visibly, because otherwise the de-alerting is not credible, you would have to visibly, in the middle of a crisis, move lots of nuclear weapons around?
Thank you for the fit of empathy. I'm Martin Fleck. I'm the coordinator of the Campaign for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World. And thanks to the hosts for putting this together. Obviously, the number that we like is 0. And so my question actually is for Dr. Halperin, because when I heard your proposal, it sounded to me as though, yes, we are still moving towards 0, we are still moving towards fewer nuclear weapons, but it sounded to me like 70 or so years down the road is when we might actually see getting to 0. My question is that given that any nation can opt out of the Nonproliferation Treaty with 6 months notice, Do you really expect that the non-nuclear nations would stay party to that treaty and that the non-proliferation system would stay intact for the better part of a century while this process continues?
Thank you. And just for analytic completeness, I will put Ben's superpower question back on the table.
The U.S. would still be a superpower if it had no nuclear weapons.
Perfect. You, Dr. Blackman, you had a specific question about your work.
Right. Well, Walt asked about the smaller nuclear powers. The architecture I have in mind sees the larger powers going first and making big reductions in their arsenals, but at some point the smaller powers have to join in. The process can't continue, with the U.S. or Russia going to zero while North Korea or whoever, retains a small nuclear arsenal. But there's plenty of time. I don't envision 40 years of negotiations and 100 years of implementation, but I envision a 20-year implementation period following 4 years or so of negotiation. And certainly over a 20-year period, the whole dynamic would change and there would be plenty of time to provide the assurances and the comprehensive security arrangements which would permit the smaller powers to join into the agreement as well. And what powers like Israel have to consider in looking at the future is whether they prefer a world in which there are no nuclear weapon states at some point, or a world in which they face certainly one additional nuclear power who hates them, and the possibility of many nuclear powers who hate them. Which world is more attractive to them? At some point they'll have to deal with that, but they don't have to deal with it at the beginning of the process. Certainly the U.S. would continue to be a nuclear a superpower if it had no nuclear weapons, if no other country had nuclear weapons. If we were to unilaterally give up our weapons, then I think we would face a very substantial problem in terms of how other countries relate to us. In my view, I don't favor giving up our weapons unilaterally by any means. And then there was a question about the fuel cycle and how that fits in. And I think you can walk and chew gum, and several things can proceed at the same time. And I do think that this commitment to elimination by a date certain changes everything. It changes the way the non-nuclear weapon states look at proposals like fissile material cutoff and multinational fuel cycles or arrangements for multinational controls over fissile materials. It's so long as we retain this context of vague commitment, which no one takes seriously, that the same dynamic is going to govern these negotiations and keep us in stalemate, except for the increasing proliferation of weapons to other countries.
Dr. Halperin?
And I think that a statement by the United States that it is ready to negotiate a treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons will be taken exactly as the same kind of rhetoric, that nobody will believe we really expect it to happen or that it is meaningful. And I do not think the NPT process can survive the process, whether you think it's 25 years or, as I think, 50 years, while we negotiate this treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons. I think we changed the dynamic by the President of the United States saying we have nuclear weapons only for the purpose of preventing others from using them. We will not produce them, we will not test them, we will not develop new weapons. We are ready to have an international fuel cycle in which all states are treated equal. That is, all states get their fuel from the same international process. And that may mean that all the reactors that produce fuel are in states that don't have nuclear weapons. But whatever the process is, it is one that treats all states equally. And in order to do that, we will declare our entire stockpile, destroy most of it, and make the rest visible to international inspection. I think that changes the dynamic because we do it rather than simply say, we're ready to begin a process of negotiating the elimination of nuclear weapons. I think U.S. conventional military policy is a critical element of this, which has not been discussed because it gets us involved in much more complicated issues. We basically have demonstrated to the Iranians that we will attack countries that don't have nuclear weapons and not countries that do have nuclear weapons. And how that's supposed to lead the Iranians to decide that they should not get nuclear weapons, I don't understand. And our saying we're for the elimination of nuclear weapons does not change that dynamic, because it sounds to the Iranians as if we're saying we want to get rid of everybody's nuclear weapons, so we're free to invade whatever countries we want to invade without fear of nuclear retaliation. And I think reestablishing the credibility of the American commitment to the UN treaty and the provisions on when it is acceptable to go to war and not go to war is as important as any other change in U.S. policy, and it will take a long time for us to undo, I think, the damage that was done by the invasion of Iraq and the threats against Iran. On de-alerting in a crisis, I would not alert in a crisis. I think the military have to be told that we need a posture of the storage of nuclear weapons, which enables them to survive any plausible attack on them, and then days or weeks later to reconstitute for an attack. I think we can design such a posture. The only country that's conceivably could launch such an attack is the Russians. As I've said, I think that's not a plausible scenario in any case, but I think that has to be the design characteristic. The last thing in the world you want to do is re-alert or move the weapons in a crisis.
Last word to Dr. Cantor.
This is more in the form of a footnote than a benediction. The project that I've been discussing is a project to come up with a new U.S. nuclear weapons policy. It is not about conventional weapons. It's also not a new U.S. nuclear non-proliferation policy. There are obviously a lot of complementarities, but just to be clear that what we are talking about and what we're not. I would assume that, or I would hope, that there would be an analogous exercise with respect to U.S. non-proliferation policy. I would hope and assume that the nuclear fuel cycle would be at the heart of a U.S. non-proliferation policy. And I believe that it is an issue which is equal to the question of nuclear weapons with respect to its importance and urgency.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.